Everyone, and welcome to Peace Talks, the PSRP webinar series. Um, I'm going to give folks joining a minute or two more, and then I will start with the introduction and some housekeeping for the webinar. But do give us a minute or two till the Zoom room fills up. Today we will be talking amnesties, how and why they're used in response to conflict, and how choices regarding amnesty design can complement inclusive peace building. I'm very happy to say that with us today is Professor Louise Mallinder of Queen's University Belfast School of Law. Now, before I move into telling you more about Professor Mallinder, a couple of housekeeping rules. So first, you may notice that we are recording this session. We will only be recording this intro and the presentation itself, not the Q&A afterwards. I hope everyone will be okay with that. I would kindly ask you to keep your microphones off during Professor Mallinder's presentation, and then we can get those running again in the Q&A section. As for cameras, it's always nice for the presenter to see some smiling and nodding faces. So if you are able to keep your camera on, that would be lovely. Since Professor Mallinder will be sharing slides, it's probably best to move to gallery view on Zoom. That will give you the best sort of proportion of slides to people's faces. And another final bit of housekeeping has to do with Q&A. So apart from me, I'm Sanya Badaniak with the Political Settlements Research Program in the University of Edinburgh School of Law. There's also Alison Doby, another one of the fantastic PSRP people. So both Alison and I are available via direct chat for any questions you may have during Professor Mallinder's presentation. You can also put your questions into the chat. And so we're going to start with a combination of questions that come in via these direct messages, group chat, and anyone who indicates to us that they wish to speak once the presentation is over. So you can use the raise hand function on Zoom. So you can, if you go to participants, there's a raise hand function there, or you can try waving, and I'll try to keep track of everyone's video, but I promise we will do our best to get to everyone. Please note that Alison is putting some links into the chat, so do keep an eye out for those. All right, now I think housekeeping is done, and allow me to introduce Professor Louise Mallinder, as I said, Professor of Law at Queen's University Belfast School of Law. She is interested in international human rights law, international criminal law, and law and politics in political transitions. Her particular research interest and expertise lie in the area of amnesty laws, also the role of lawyers as actors in transitions, and she's also interested in socio-legal research methods that are related to transitional justice. She has conducted fieldwork in numerous locations, from Northern Ireland, where she's based, to Cambodia, Chile, South Africa, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Israel, Palestine, and so on. Louise's monograph was awarded the 2009 Hart SLS a Early Career Award and was jointly awarded the 2009 British Society of Criminology Book Prize. Louise is also the vice chair of the Committee on the Administration of Justice, a human rights non-governmental organization in Northern Ireland. It is with this background and expertise that Professor Mallinder has developed the new Amnesties Conflict and Peace Agreement database in collaboration with the PSRP. You can find this fantastic database at peaceagreements.org/amnesties. But let me stop here and give the floor to Professor Mallinder. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Sanya, for that introduction, and thank you very much to PSRP for organising today's webinar. I'm going to share some slides, as Sanya mentioned, so I'm just going to bring them up now. So hopefully you are all able to see those okay, and I'll just full screen them. Great, I can see you nodding. Thank you, Sanya. So in my presentation today, I'm going to do a couple of things. First of all, I just want to begin by giving a bit of a background to this database about why it was created and what we hope it will achieve. And then I will provide you with an overview of what's actually in the database and how you might use it. And then towards the end of the presentation, I will share some of the findings from the database. So going firstly to why did I create the database? So for those of you who know me, you'll probably know that I have been working on different versions of this database for a long time. I think it goes back initially to about 2003. And at that stage, much of the writing on amnesties was dominated by experiences in Latin America, where amnesties tended to be self-amnesties introduced by dictatorial regimes in relation to serious human rights violations, and they were by and large intended to create impunity and grant unconditional amnesty. And on the other side, there was the experience of the amnesty granted as part of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was an amnesty that was granted as part of a negotiated settlement. And it was very much built into a process that was intended to deliver truth and some form of restorative justice to victims. So when I started this work, discussions about amnesties were dominated by narrow sets of ideas about what amnesties could be, and those ideas are quite different from each other. So I started trying to gather up a broader range of information on amnesties to look at how representative these two forms of amnesty were of the broader field. And I wanted in particularly to look at how amnesties were designed, to explore the differences that existed in different countries, and to try and see what the examples of different countries can tell us about how amnesties can be used to further human rights objectives. And there I'm thinking particularly about the duty to prevent human rights violations or to deliver peace, but also duties to ensure victims' rights to truth, justice, and reparations. And so in addition to trying to gather qualitative information to describe different types of amnesty processes, I also wanted to use the database to identify patterns on how amnesties are used around the world. And I'll show you some of that data towards the end of the presentation today. And because I come from a law background, I then used those patterns to try and reflect about what that told us about the status of amnesties under international law. Of course, states granting amnesties is just one form of state practice, but it's an important one. And it feeds into some of the debates around the legality of amnesties for certain sets of international crimes and human rights violations. So this database has been ongoing for a long time, but I'd always envisaged that it would be publicly available. And I'm really grateful to PSRP for helping me finally achieve that aim this year. But so with that in mind, I always assumed that it would provide a resource for scholars, policymakers, and activists who are either researching amnesties for different types of research purposes, or who are actually grappling with decisions about how to design or respond to amnesty policies in different countries. So I thought it'd be a resource that would be useful for diverse groups. And also through my collaboration with PSRP, a further aim developed within the database project to try and use it to track the implementation of peace agreement amnesty commitments. And that's something I'll talk a little bit more about later on. So what is included in the Amnesty's Conflict and Peace Agreement database? So I think the first thing to bear in mind here is that this is only collecting data on amnesties. Now, there are a small number of other amnesty databases around the world. They don't tend to have the detailed qualitative information that this database does. It tends to be more quantitative coding on whether amnesties exist or not, but they all use different definitions of what an amnesty is. So I think it's quite important to always be careful about when you're looking at a database or seeing how many there are, that to be transparent about what you mean by amnesty. So you can see the definition I use on the screen there, and that is that amnesties are legal or policy measures that at a minimum remove criminal liability for wrongdoing prior to conviction. So the quote continues to say that amnesties can have other legal effects that apply to those who've already been convicted, but those are in addition to this core function of protecting individuals who have not yet been convicted. So this way, my database perhaps differs from some others that include things like pardons or sentence releases as forms of amnesties. And that term amnesty terminology is used in some countries for post-conviction measures, but that's not what this database does. In addition to that, to be included in this database, I am only counting amnesties that were actually a thing, not just a promise, because some other databases do that, where if a government offers to grant an amnesty if a rebel group surrenders, that will be included in the database irrespective of whether the amnesty was in fact implemented or not. But for the database, amnesties are only included if they're actually enacted into formal law, or I can find evidence that they have been implemented in practice in some ways. I'm also only looking at amnesties granted by government institutions. There are a number of amnesties that are granted by non-state armed groups, particularly those groups that are able to have effective control over a territory or a population. They might in certain instances grant amnesties. I haven't included those within this study. And while my larger database work on amnesties looks at amnesties used in all types of political crises, the ACPA dataset is looking primarily at amnesties related to armed conflict and amnesties related to peace agreements. So that's the focus of this piece of work. Within that, we've identified 289 amnesties that were granted from 1990 to 2016. That relates to amnesties in 75 countries, plus 2 other amnesties that were granted jointly by 2 countries. So what you can see there straight away is that obviously many countries are introducing amnesty more than once. The reasons for doing so can be that they're repeating the same amnesty over and over again, or it can be that they're using different forms of amnesty for different purposes at different stages over that time period. So there's a lot of diversity in how that's used. The database does cover all world regions, and there are examples coming from all parts of the world that are included in the data. And I think what's also important to note is this data set looks at all forms of conflict-related amnesty. So what I mean by that is I'm not looking only at amnesties for non-state armed groups or only at amnesties that speak to international crimes in some way. I'm looking at the full ways in which amnesties are used in conflict-related settings, which could include amnesties for refugees or for persons who've been involved in draft evasion or desertion, for example. So it's quite a broad spectrum of different purposes that amnesties are used for. And just the last point to note here is that this database is structured around amnesty processes. So what that means is each piece of legislation relating to an amnesty is not a separate entry in the database. Instead, I organize it around a single amnesty process, and that description of that process is then built from the various legal texts where they're available, plus secondary sources. So one amnesty process might be based on a peace agreement that has an amnesty commitment, a piece of legislation that then implements that peace agreement commitment, regulations that give effect to the legislation, subsequent laws that amend or repeal the initial amnesty law, or judicial decisions that affect the shape of the amnesty as well. So the amnesty processes within this database can evolve over time, and there's often a lot of legal text that goes into one amnesty process. So now I'm going to give you a glimpse of what the database looks like. So this is a screen grab from the database on the PSRP website, or and what you can see firstly at the top is some introductory text. And I'm sorry, apologies if the font is very small for you in your display, but there is a little hyperlink there to the codebook. And if you are using this database, I'd encourage you to have a look at the codebook, because it gives a more fulsome explanation of my coding decisions about what goes into each category. And so it's an important resource for that. Then beneath the introductory text, you can see two little boxes. One that's grayed out or one that's darker in color that says simple search, and one says advanced search. I'll talk about advanced search in a minute, but simple search relates to the search box underneath. And what that is a free text search. So if there's particular words or groups you're interested in, you could type them in there and it will return all the amnesties related to that. What might be useful for that would be, for example, Al-Shabaab are a non-state armed group that operate in more than one country, and as a result have been granted amnesties in more than one country. So you could type Al-Shabaab in there and then get a list of all the amnesties that relate to that group. Alternatively, if you are interested in knowing how drug trafficking is handled in amnesty legislation, so it's often not the primary crime that amnesty legislation deals with, but it is something that you see mentioned sometimes as part of the loosely termed fundraising activities that different groups engage in. And so you could type that into the search box and you'll get a return showing you all the amnesties that have explicitly mentioned this crime, either to include it or exclude it from the scope of the amnesty law. I will say that while you're using those types of free text searches, be careful to use all possible permutations of the term you're looking for. You know, different countries use different terminology for the same offence. And so it could be that you want to try out a few different terms to get a comprehensive result. The other thing to notice on the screen is running down the left-hand side where it says filter by context. You have a lot of options here for filtering your search results. So at the top under timing, you have dates. You can search for amnesties between particular dates. So for example, if you were interested only in amnesties that came into effect after the International Criminal Court started functioning, you could look for amnesties introduced after the 1st July 2002. Where the box on sequencing is a useful one, because that gives you a drop-down list that relates to the moment in a country's journey from conflict to peace that the amnesty was introduced. So it could be at times of ongoing conflict where no negotiations have been commenced. It can be a pre-negotiation period where amnesty has been offered as a way to kickstart the negotiations. It could be in the middle of the negotiations as part of a comprehensive peace agreement, or in a post-agreement period. And so that if you wanted to look at amnesties at particular moments, that sequencing box is helpful for that. I think region is quite self-explanatory. It's the main world regions that the amnesties are contained in. The ones I want to highlight particularly is has conditions, and that's quite useful because it allows you to filter your search based on whether you want conditional or unconditional amnesties. And I'll speak more in a few moments about what I mean by conditional amnesties. The legislation box is because I have tried as far as I can to find the primary text of all relevant legal documents relating to each amnesty process. It has not always been possible to do that, and in some instances I have compiled the amnesty sources or profiles drawing on secondary sources only. So if you are interested only in looking at the profiles based on primary legislation, you should tick yes within that box there. So that filter would help you do that. So then turning to the advanced search. So here, all the filters are remaining the same, but what changes is this part in the center here where it says category and component. So category is the broad issues within amnesty processes, and I'll show you these in a moment when we look at a particular profile, but it relates to, say, crimes, recipients, conditions, legal effects. And once you select a category, you can click on all components, and then that will let you choose particular aspects of that category. So you could choose the category of crimes and then look for international crimes being included. And what you would get then is a list of all amnesties that are coded as having international crimes included within them. What's really interesting to note here is you can combine a filter with these types of searches, and you can add multiple searches there. So if you wanted to look at amnesties for state actors only, plus amnesties for international crimes only, you can build up a search cumulatively that way. For me, that's where the database becomes really interesting, when you can start drilling down in the data in those ways. And it means you can find some quite interesting things. So for me, I was particularly interested, probably in light of the statute of limitations proposals in the UK over the last few years, to look at where unconditional amnesties have been granted for state actors. And so I could find that was very unusual and only really happened in non-democratic countries. And I could also find that amnesties granted, because I was particularly interested in Northern Ireland, where there's not just the statute of limitations for the overseas operations, but various proposals have been made relating to prosecutions for crimes here. And I found it very, very unusual that amnesties would be granted very late in a post-agreement period, but where they were, they tended to be more for state actors and also tended to be more unconditional. So you can use these types of combinations of filters and advanced search to drill down into particular questions that in a way that I find quite useful. So turning now to the what the data actually looks like. So I've mentioned this is a qualitative database. So you get quite a lot of text describing each of the amnesty processes within the database. So here I've chosen to bring up information relating to El Salvador 1992. So you can see that at the top. And then beneath that, there's a series of gray boxes. So these are the categories I mentioned. There's basic information, enactment processes, recipients, crimes, conditions, implementation process, which relates to which body granted the amnesty, whether there was an appeals process, what voice victims had in the process, for example, and then legal scope. And I'll explain that one more in a little while. So you can tab between those if you're on the website and have a look at the different aspects of it. On this basic profile website, I just want to show you here, you have in bold the various components of this category of basic information. So the different headings are shown in bold. Where a field is left blank in the database, it doesn't appear here. So if you're looking at clicking different amnesties on the database, you might find that some headings appear for one and not for another, and it's because they're blank in the original data for those amnesties, because the amnesty was silent on a particular issue, for example. But here into basic information, you get an idea of how one amnesty process relates to several relevant laws. So you can see the initial law listed there, and then you have an explanation that Article 6 was then interpreted by a subsequent decree, and then Article 6 was repealed by another law. So you can kind of trace the main documents. And then towards the bottom of the screen, you see the start of what is a list of sources of information. And so I've included this for all of the amnesty processes in the database to try and show the types of sources that provide you with further information on this particular amnesty, and which I found useful in providing me with some of the context to either input data into the descriptions or inform my coding decisions when I was coding this particular amnesty process. So there's a lot of the length of sources of information will vary between country depending on the amount of available information, but it's a good starting point if you're interested in learning more about any particular country. Then turning to some of the different categories that we looked at here, I brought up an example from the database on Libya in 2012, because I think it shows a few different interesting things that illustrates how I was coding the information. So the first thing you can see as you scan down the screen, and hopefully the text is large enough to permit you to do that, but you can see I'm referring to Article 2 or Article 1, and then it's in direct quotes. So what I'm doing when I'm coding the information as far as possible is providing the actual text that appeared in the laws. So you can, it's a way of checking my coding, but also to kind of see the actual language that's being used. In some instances, so if you look down to where it says common crimes excluded, point 2, it says hooded crimes were referred to the judiciary, and then there's square brackets. So what that is that's an explanation of what hooded crimes are. So I've added an extra interpretation in there. I do this in quite a few places through the database, particularly where, for example, an amnesty says amnesty is granted for articles 1, 2, 3, and 4 of the criminal code and doesn't explain what they are. I would, if possible, then try and look up the criminal code and copy and paste the provisions in square brackets to add to that interpretation. The other point to note here is if you look at the very top, it says international crimes included. Now, a challenge for me in creating this database is that very few amnesty laws say we're granting amnesty for international crimes. There are only 2 that say they're granting amnesty for war crimes, and none explicitly say we're granting amnesty for crimes against humanity or for genocide. But of course, we know that many more amnesties did in fact grant amnesty for international crimes. So I have to not rely just on the text of the law, but I have to try and interpret when to code something as including international crimes. So a couple of other database creators, or at least one of the database creator, has taken the position that all conflict-related amnesties relate to international crimes. And so unless there's an explicit exclusion, they have coded them as including international crimes. I have not done that for 2 reasons. Firstly, as I mentioned, this data set looks at all forms of amnesty relating to conflict. And so for amnesties for refugees, for example, or draft evaders and deserters, international crimes are not relevant necessarily to those types of amnesties. Secondly, as you heard from Sanya, I live and work in Belfast. And here, when we talk about the legacy of the conflict, we would talk about how there were serious human rights violations, but we'd never really use the language of war crimes or crimes against humanity or genocide. And so I, based on that experience, don't automatically assume that a conflict entails international crimes. So what I then try and do is look for an authoritative source that talks about an amnesty applying to those crimes. And I will then directly quote that source. So authoritative sources for me here are things like judicial decisions, decisions of UN treaty bodies, or human rights, reputable human rights reports. So Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International. So what you see here is an example of Human Rights Watch saying that this amnesty could be including international crimes. And then you would get the reference to the full reference for that report in the sources of information. I will say that I think because of that, my approach there being quite cautious in terms of trying to find authoritative sources, and they're not always possible to find for all conflict-related amnesties. Some conflicts are just written about less than others or receive less international attention. So I think as a result, I probably undercount some of the amnesties that include international crimes, but this is all explained in quite a lot of detail in the code book, if you want to look back at some of that. So that's what the database looks like and what it contains. Now, I realize I've been talking for quite a while, but just in the last few moments, I'm just going to introduce some of the indicative findings. And here, rather than drilling down into some of the combinations of filters and different searches, here I'm just kind of giving a headline overview so you get a feel for what's in the database. So firstly, at the top of this slide, you can see a line chart that illustrates the number of amnesties in the database by looking at amnesties per year. The blue line tells you amnesties per year, and then the orange line, to provide some context for that, gives you the number of comprehensive peace agreements each year, and I've used PAX as my data source for that. For both, I've added a trend line. I'm not sure whether it'll probably show up for you, but they're little dotted lines. And I think it's interesting to see that across this time period, the trend line shows a decline for the number of amnesties introduced each year. Although I will note that the steepness of that decline is probably due in part to how high the number of amnesties was in 1991, due to the end of the Cold War. That was a particularly big year for amnesties. And so I think if you're starting this time chart at a later point, that decline would look less steep. The other chart on this slide relates to the timing of amnesties, and this is the little drop-down sequencing box I was talking about there. So apologies that the axis label is probably too small for you to see, but what this is showing you is the light blue segment relates to amnesties that are introduced during conflict when no negotiations are ongoing. So you can see the largest number of amnesties within this data set falls within that category. We then have a small number shown in orange of pre-negotiation amnesties, followed by grey mid-negotiation amnesties. Yellow shows you the comprehensive peace agreement ones, and blue shows you post-agreement amnesties. And I will say here, post-agreement amnesties are amnesties that were not envisaged in the original peace agreement, but were proposed sometime later, but relate back to the conflict-related offences. Oh, sorry, wrong direction, apologies. Then, before I get into the next chunk of slides, I just want to mention how amnesties are used for inclusion and exclusion, because I think that provides useful context to think about the data in the next few slides. So for me, I believe that the way an amnesty is designed can shape the extent to which an amnesty can foster vertical and horizontal inclusion at the end of a conflict, or can operate to exclude certain actors after a conflict has ended. And it's of course possible for one amnesty to simultaneously seek to include some groups whilst excluding others. And I think some of the key design choices that are relevant to this relate to the scope of the amnesty, which recipients are covered, which crimes are covered or which are excluded, what types of conditionality are attached, and what types of legal effects are granted. And when I say but including and excluding others, you can imagine an amnesty that excludes those who are deemed to be most responsible for campaigns of violence, but then grants measures to try and support the reintegration of lower level offenders into society afterwards. So this chart shows you some of the ideas of limitations or scopes within, scope within the amnesty. At the top, you can see crimes. The first couple of columns talks about the number of amnesties that include international crimes, shown in dark blue, or exclude them, shown in light blue. I think that's by far the biggest, political crimes are by far the biggest category of crimes included in the amnesties in this database. And I think that's not a surprise given that I'm looking at conflict-related offences. The next biggest category is draft evasion and desertion, and then it's followed by international crimes. And so I think what's interesting here when you look at this chart is that you can see the dark blue for international crimes being included and the light blue for international crimes being excluded are roughly the same size. So we're not seeing many more amnesties excluding international crimes than including them. And I think what's also interesting to note here is neither of those columns is too tall. You know, I think it's about 22% of the amnesties in the database include international crimes and 23% exclude them. So overall, that means that less than half of the amnesties in this database relate to international crimes, which is an interesting finding given that that is a particular aspect of amnesties that it receives the most international scrutiny when thinking about whether an amnesty is permissible, for example. The bottom chart shows you the recipients of amnesties included in this database. So by far the biggest category of recipients are non-state armed groups. You can see the column next to that is state actors. So much fewer amnesties relate to state actors than to non-state armed groups, which is interesting because for a long time this idea of amnesties being self-amnesties granted by repressive rulers was weighed heavy on transitional justice literature because of the experience in South America. But what you can see there is actually the reality looks quite different from that in terms of the use of amnesties, at least for conflict settings. Then running down from that, you have draft dodging and desertion, nationals who are outside borders, which can be refugees or people who political dissidents or other groups who fled, security detainees, which is an interesting category because it includes people who are being detained on security charges, but they're not always related to actual participation in armed violence. It could be political dissidents, for example. And then there's coup participants and foreigners. And what the foreigners usually means is individuals who have traveled from their own country to take part in a non-state armed group in another country. And then turning to conditions, the first point to note is I found that 37% of amnesties are unconditional, which in itself was interesting because I think in the literature there was often an assumption that amnesties were more often unconditional than that. So I think that that is useful. Then on the chart, you can see the different types of conditions that are generally attached. Now, the left-hand side of the chart with the higher columns relates to DDR, renouncing violence, non-recidivism. And so those conditions are about bringing peace and stability to your country. Now, of course, there is an element there that is about ensuring guarantees of non-repetition for victims, which is part of the idea of reparations. But the focus of those types of conditions is much broader on societal factors. What you see the other side of the dotted line there is conditions that are much more narrowly focused on victims' rights to truth, to reparations, to justice. And so these are conditions where to gain an amnesty, individuals must contribute to reparations in some form, symbolic or material, or must commit to taking part in a traditional or local or alternative justice process, or must commit to telling the truth in some way about their actions. So those are conditions that people have to perform. And if they fail to perform them, the amnesty can be taken away or denied. Then turning to legal effects. And I think this was particularly interesting for me because I think I haven't come across anything that's been written previously about the full range of things that amnesties can do. There's a lot of confusion around what amnesty actually means, and where they are written about, it's generally in terms of preventing prosecutions. But what you can see on the slide is that they have a much wider range of effects that can include releasing convicted prisoners, granting immunity from administrative sanctions. And here I'm using the term administrative sanctions to mean all sorts of measures that relate to individuals' ability to gain employment in certain professions or the public sector, individuals' ability to stand for public office, to participate in elections, to benefit from a pension for public service employment previously, or indeed other conditions attached to their behaviour, such as owning weapons or drinking. I think it's included in some amnesty process, drinking alcohol, I should say, it's included in some amnesty processes. So it can be a wide range of measures, and amnesties can grant immunity of administrative sanctions. They can remove administrative sanctions already imposed, or they can impose new administrative sanctions at different times. They can also expose criminal records or prevent civil remedies. And so what you can see there in these options, and particularly when you think about conditions and the scope as well, is that amnesties can vary considerably in how broad and generous they are, like broad in terms of the scope and generous they are in terms of the types of protections they give, or how narrow they are in terms of the limitations of their scope, the types of conditions that people are required to go through to get the amnesty, and in the types of legal effects that they have. And in some instances, the amnesties can impose restrictions themselves on the behavior of different actors. So it just gives you a bit of an overview of the different forms that the amnesties can take. Now, my last slide there had the links, but I realize Alison's already put those in the chat. So I will end the slideshow at this point.